Welcome to the April 2024 CIECA webinar, CIECA API Standards, a roadmap for the future. I'm Paul Berry, Executive Director for CIECA. The Collision Industry Electronic Commerce Association, or CIECA, develops and promotes electronic communication standards that allow the collision industry to be more efficient. We also provide webinars like this one to help educate both members and non-members on trends that impact systems, processes, and the exchange of data across the industry. Today's presenters are Dan Webster, Principal Architect for Enlight, as well as Chair of the CIECA Architecture Committee. Joining him is Paulette Reed, Project Coordinator for CIECA. As we start the webinar, I want to remind you there is no verbal communication between the participants and the presenter. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them in the question panel on the webinar screen. We will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. And now I will turn it over to Dan and Paulette.
Hi, everyone. So we've got quite a show for you, telling you what we've done so far with CAPIS, which is the future referred to in the slide here. So 2022, by this time, REST APIs were commonplace, and organizations represented on CIECA's Architecture Committee were separately adapting the current BMS standards to JSON for new integrations. Several of our committee members talked about doing the same thing in our own ways. As CIECA's architects, we moved forward with the next generation standard, formally representing industry data exchanges in JSON and Open API specification. We named it CIECA Application Programming Specification, CAPIS, with tentative version releases, 001, if that doesn't say tentative, I don't know what does. That was April of last year, and a slightly more polished version, 010, last October. This slide details why member organizations were moving on from BMS and from XML, and it's all true and relevant. But for my comments, I'll just say that in 2003, CIECA knew the time was right to move on from EDI standards to XML. And 20 years later, moving on from SOAP and XML to REST and JSON was at least as obvious as 2023's decision. When I was just learning JSON schema, and this 2020 timeline is about then, Andy Bober at Integral was writing automation to build BMS JSON schemas from our XML ones. I remember two takeaways from this. First, JSON schemas architects valued simplicity, such that many XML schema features that CIECA had used, even overused and misused, were not supported. And two, our BMS XML schemas were just too big and too complex. CIECA's vision for our API specification standard was to do it natively with our modern tools, Open API specification and JSON schema, and to rigorously follow design principles and a style guide. Finally, to keep it simple and small, to coin a phrase, we made it as big as it needs to be and as small as it can be. So the automated conversion of XML schema to JSON schemas hadn't worked out. But your architecture committee wasn't done with false starts. We decided to start where a collision claim starts, with first notice of loss. But we found we had unwittingly located one of BMS's most complex messages, with nested groupings of vehicles, properties, passengers, occupants, individuals, seat positions. So Paulette, shown here on the right, and Mike had us move on. Although it sneaked its way onto this swing and miss slide, a VIN decoder to a vehicle object was our first success story, with an opportunity to find complete, meaningful BMS examples and show how they could be represented in JSON and Open API. If you were to join us in CIECA architecture, you might not hear about OAS 3.1 or our JSON style guide in every meeting, but you'll very likely hear about zero-based budgeting and flattening, our two main pathways to simplifying. With zero-based budgeting, we rigorously justify every object and property instead of blindly carrying over elements from previous integrations like BMS. The BMS had speculative components that may not be industry relevant any longer, and even retained misspelled tags for backward compatibility. This zero-based budgeting approach ensures our interfaces are lean and purposeful. Flattening refers to our shift away from the previous rule of 7 plus or minus 2 that required breaking up aggregates with more than 11 elements into further nested structures. Our current JSON style guide, on the other hand, promotes flatter data models by avoiding extraneous levels of hierarchy, by elevating properties from unnecessary child objects into their parents. And when I talk about unnecessary child objects, that would be based on the mechanical conversion of the BMS to JSON. And at that point, we're going to end up with many more properties and fewer levels of hierarchy. The single data dictionary, or big F dictionary as we like to call it, is a big point of pride for the CAPAS team. We've gathered every property and every object into this dictionary. Then we can do schemas for API endpoints with literal references to these dictionary entries. And at our last meeting just a couple of days ago, we were using this dictionary to find out in the conversion of EMS and BMS properties we'll talk about later, and whether it had made it into our dictionary. And since we'd had the foresight to alphabetize the entries, we could tell when something wasn't going to be found there. It really has promoted efficiency. And an additional file is the code list schema. So we have one properties definitions dictionary and one code list schema. And I consider this a big point of progress, that we've got one code list schema instead of BMS's 2, where we had a open code list dictionary and a closed code list dictionary, and sometimes with the same code lists in both. So currently it's mercifully manageable with 58 code lists, but eventually we'll need to face up to the necessity of many more of BMS's 185 code lists. These paint chips on the right are the objects we build CAPAS messages or endpoint payloads in open API terms from. With these properties from the first 2 CAPAS releases, I have found that my company can build APIs for assignments and claims, and Mike and Jeff from our committee are finding utility for their parts APIs as well. It's labeled JSON test instances because before, during, and after our schema and open API development, we focus on examples of what a payload looks like. And these are shown as examples in an open API spec document as well. Our build process then has a batch validation step where our schemas can validate hundreds of these valid and invalid test instances in seconds. This process, adapted from contributors' earlier work with XML schema tools, really promotes high quality work products. So on from our 2 releases we've done of CAPAS so far, we've now, with zero-based budgeting and focusing on the needs of assignments, claims, and parts integrations, we've converted hundreds of BMS XML elements to CAPAS JSON property names. But BMS had 2,000 such elements, not just hundreds. So we're tackling the remainder with this EMS BMS to CAPAS conversion document. Simply stated, it's a shared Google Docs spreadsheet listing all the EMS fields and BMS elements we've created over the years. And they're in one column, and their CAPAS replacement names are shown side by side in another column. This is the easy part, listing them. applying our style guide and naming conventions. But what's harder is we then have to apply zero-based budgeting and flattening. And this is a more analytical exercise, as we've gotten a feel for in working through this for about the last month in the CIECA Architecture Committee. And that effort continues, but it's really addressing a question that was pretty foundational to CAPAS, which is the question, we call it the Chris Polis problem of how do I convert a BMS message that we're been using for some time into a JSON and open API spec. And as I told you, we've done this for 3 important messages, but there's many more to go. And we want the list of properties and the flattening of the objects to be ready for people's upcoming implementations. So in front of us here is that shared Google Doc. And I think, yeah, the properties for, or the elements, fields from EMS, elements from BMS are shown there in field A. And then the full path for it when you get to column, what was that, E? And I'm guessing further over to the right, we'll see our ongoing efforts to give these names for CAPAS. The simple part is we have a JSON style guide that we use camel case. One's always starting with a lowercase letter, converting things like acronyms to just words that might be capitalized, or if they start the tag name, they are all lowercase. But when we build these into messages, we can look at those in JSON. We have various automations that can say whether we're following the style guide, but you really have to do the individual analytical work on your converted message to see what makes sense. And what we've done so far is assign groupings of dozens or hundreds of the rows in here to our various architecture committee members to work through and have influence on whether something's needed, whether it can still be called what it was before, and how to move forward. And as always, we're looking for more people on that committee that we can assign these kind of tasks to. You have anything more to say about this, Paulette?
I just wanted to show everybody on line 19, for those in the EMS world, and like J, we have the RO comp date, completion date. And then if you go over, then you see that it was changed to actual completion date in our BMS, and that's used in our estimate and optional. So we have a lot of that information here, the path that is used. And then again, like Dan said, when we get to Q, we have our actual completion date and time. And you can see at this time that that's not in CAPAS. If you look here at some of our other like address, we already have address 1 and address 2 in CAPAS, and it was included in our first release. And we're keeping track of when those change. And then you'll see a few of them out here, like admin info. As Dan said, that was flattened. We didn't need admin info. We didn't need that top level any longer. So that was a flattened out thing. A lot like the coverage info, a lot of those aggregates have been flattened. So we kind of just note that it was flattened or it was zero-based budgeted. So if we know if something's not going to be moving into because it's not used or not needed anymore, we have that zero-based budgeting there. And like Dan said, we had a couple different initiatives go off, and we all segmented the chapters of the BMS into areas that we were familiar with. And then that's what if Q is either what's in Campus now or what our initial run through was. So like Dan said, we took our guidelines that we know, and we started did some automated processes over these field names. And once we got done with that, now we're individually looking at them. So we're having the individuals that look at them, they go into column S and they put their initials there. And then once that's done, then the committee gets back together and goes through all of that and makes sure that they're accepted. And then we'll try to get those moved in. Well, they're there for the next people that need those. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But right now it's like they're not in Campus, and we won't put them in Campus until a message comes up that needs those values in Campus. Anything else, Dan?
No, but that last thing you said is basically the tenet of zero-based budgeting. We don't put something in just to have completeness of everything we used before has a home in the new standard. We have to show that it's needed and used in a message. So the next slide is kind of the handover to Paulette. She manages these artifacts on CIECA's website. And this is the structure they take, our website being CIECA.com. And there's already standards out there for BMS, etc. And this shows the basic organization of how it's working on the website, which she will show you here as she takes over.
Thanks, Dan. So like Dan said, on CIECA.com, if you go under our standards and then you select products, that is where you can find our API standards here. We also have, of course, the BMS and the EMS standards, but today we're focusing on our API standards. When we click on that, we have our CAPAS guidelines, and then we have our claims. So our claims also is in our release. So on this page, I'm going to focus on our CAPAS guidelines. If you click on that, you'll see we've put a lot of information on these pages. We have our architecture review, which just kind of goes over the process, how we're gathering those tags. We're converting the tag names to camel case. We're structuring our flattened objects, and we're removing. So we have the high level here. And then we have our general guidelines that talk about JSON and how CIECA wants to minimize these schema features. And then we have our property names guidelines. And so this is where a lot of our information comes in for our document, our EMS to BMS to CAPAS conversion. We have the property name shall be camel case, which you've all seen. We treat acronyms as property names like any other word. So that's something that is different than XML as well. Acronyms should always be used when they are on the CAPAS list. So we have identified the acronyms that we want to use. We have singular versus plural, so we only use the plural property names for arrays and the singular names for all other properties. Arrays should consist of bare objects with enveloping. CIECA has a historical store of property names and the acronyms, and so we take that and extend that list if we needed to. And then we have avoid breaking the record the longest property name. So we're not making really long property names, of course. The use of a sub plus a word, second word should not be capitalized. So we have like subcategory and subtype. So these are just rules that we're using as we're converting. CIECA has VMS appendix with the list of standard abbreviations. So we have, number, count, quantity. So we're trying to keep those all to the same abbreviation. And if we have an abbreviation, then we always use the abbreviation instead of using the full word. So services do not need to be abbreviated, and we do not use the underbar in names. So when you're going through that list, you'll see these are our property guidelines. And then we have property value guidelines, which we have our Boolean, our numbers, our strings, property value data types, just a little bit more information there that you can click on the date and type stamps. We have an example out here of the enveloping and the camel case and arrays and how we built that. And then we have some common definitions out here. So this is just a guideline to help everybody when they're trying to move their XML to a new API. The other thing that we wanted to look at is our releases. So if we go here with our API, we have our CIECA API release, and if you click on the API release, it's you can click on the current release, and if you're signed in and have your membership, then you can dive down into get the schemas, the open APIs, and the test instances that Dan pointed out earlier. Then if you don't want to go through that, all the driving down, we do have the data dictionary, which you could pull up through the CAPAS data dictionary. And we have the master code list that you could see. If you know adjustment type number, you'll be very familiar with these values as well from the BMS. And then we have the schemas, and you could see that list. And our test instances. So there's different ways of getting into what you need to see, but all that information is there. So the new API development process, we just kind of wanted to go over this process and make sure that everybody's aware that CIECA is here to help everybody in the industry to create these messages. The best way to do that is to just send an email or call Paul or myself or Stacy and identify that you have a need. Just the same as we did with the BMS, if you had a new field or if you have a new code list value. But if you're working on any APIs and you would like to work and make that industry standard to help develop that API standard, reach out to us. We'll look at it. We'll see which committee that would be the best fit. And we will set that committee up. Committees, they all work together to determine all of the elements and data names and everything that we need in the type of message. And once the committee agrees on that, then we send it to the architecture committee. The architecture committee, as Dan says, will review it, make sure that it goes with our guidelines and our rules that we have in place. And if everything looks good, then it's approved. If not, the architecture team will send back some recommendations to the committee. The committee can work through that again until approval. Then once the approval is met, architecture will again get that work moved into the next release. And as Dan said, we will be working with all of our tools to make sure that they are tested, and we have a vigorous QA process. So right now we have some API messages that are in architecture review, and these are new messages that did not exist in the BMS. So we have a referral message, and the referral committee is working on or has worked on a message to help refer an assignment or refer an object to another team. So a common scenario here would be at the time of an accident, a company, third party would say that we need a rental and we need a tow. So they're not approving this, they're just making a referral, asking somebody else to provide that referral or that rental and to provide that tow. And this will allow the referral to come through, that driver of the vehicle to get a replacement vehicle and get a tow with just limited communication themselves, reaching out and making those phone calls. And then there'll also be, of course, reporting and stuff that can be done on those data elements. And then our AI message that we're working on, again, this is to send those pictures to the estimating systems and platforms to help get that initial estimate from our AI. The differences here is the referral kicked off prior to CAPAS, the first version of CAPAS. So a lot of the naming that we have does not line up with the CAPAS versions that we have. So we have the architecture team has a number of recommendations to go back to the referral committee. The AI committee, however, when they kicked off, it started after CAPAS. So they'd already seen those guidelines and they had already seen the naming standards. So a lot of the information that we have in our AI committee is valid and will be going forward. The only things that we think we have going back to the AI committee are like coordinate information. And BMS coordinates was for our locations with our latitude and longitude. And now coordinates are our picture coordinates. So we do have some naming that we need to identify so that we can make sure that those objects are easily identified. Now, according to, we just kicked off our assignment and estimate committee, which is our old VDI committee. This committee is currently working on the BMS assignment and estimate. And of course, it's not going to be moving every object, but right now they have went through the EMS to BMS to CAPAS document and identified a lot of the fields that they're going to need and identified that those naming standards applied to them. And then we'll start working on those messages. And that's all I have. Does anybody have any questions?
I've got a question here regarding some recent member spotlights published on your website. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on the direct benefits for industry partners such as carpart.com and Mitchell to switch over to CAPAS from their software.
So we've got CAPAS I've been working on for these years as chairman of CIECA Architecture, but also at Mitchell, the demand for open API as the way of documenting a partner interface and using JSON for the actual payloads has long been established. This is what the professionals that are staffing our organizations and partners organizations are conversant in now and familiar with and demanding. And so the power of the latest tools to use OpenAPI, use JSON, and do it with knowledge that it has been vetted as having equivalent capabilities of, and that goes on every day and every week to make sure we haven't over flattened or gotten rid of things that folks use. But it's just very satisfying for me to see that the development teams, both here and with our trading partners, this is what they expect, what they use, and it's working out very well for us. What I had seen in the years leading up to this is, I always have a role, although I'm an enterprise architect, of troubleshooting when something particularly interesting happens. And that would, for many years, take the form of asking if they could share with me the BMS XML payloads that we were exchanging. And then I would use our schemas or whatever analytical tools I had. And maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I would see when I asked for BMS examples of what we're doing, it was called BMS, but it was actually a JSON file. And they had used some off-the-shelf tool to, once you've loaded BMS object into your implementation, you could write it out again in JSON, and it seemed like more and more that's what I was seeing. So the BMS XML as a practical matter was, or BMS JSON as a practical matter was already upon us. So to formalize it now in the JSON OpenAPI world has been very useful and productive.
Yeah, Dan, if I could just add into that, I speak with a lot of our members who've been calling over the last couple of years, and there's a strong interest to use JSON. The developers, I think a lot of times we prefer to work in it, and it is, having a flatter, simpler structure is attractive to the people that have to do the work. And so I think there's a lot of upside to adopting the CAPAS standard as we get it available. And we're probably behind the curve. I wish we were, a little a couple of years down the road further along in it. But I just want to add on another thought too, and that is that, as Dan said, we are doing zero-based budgeting, which means we're not just wholesale importing everything from the BMS over, because the BMS did, a lot of stuff got crept into the BMS over the years that we don't believe is used. But just because something doesn't come over doesn't mean it can't. If you're working with CAPAS in the future and you have a data element you don't see there that you need, please let us know. We will be happy to work with you to get it added into the CAPAS. So please don't feel that just because it's not there, it can't be, or that it's a lot of red tape to get it done. Our next question.
Another note to that is that we do have new fields in our API that we do not have in BMS or EMS. So again, we're growing, and so it's not a problem to add new fields either at this time. So if you have something that's not in the BMS that you really need out there in your API, we can do that. And then we just, the VDI team also just said we need a BMS and an API addition. So we can work with that too. So as you're going through and you see any new data that could help your industry and your use cases, please bring them to us and let us know so we can help get that built for you.
Okay, next question is, do you have a list of members who have implemented these guidelines? And Dan just spoke to that. Because the CAPA standards were released last year, so far, carpart.com and Mitchell have officially been implementing with the CAPA standards, although there's quite a bit of interest from other companies. Dan or Paulette, anything else to add to that?
Yeah, it should be obvious that all of our interfaces have partners on the other end, but I am not in the department that would know who's willing to share or whether they're CIECA members or not. But yeah, definitely from one end, there's Mitchell and then all the folks we interface with.
Thanks. Okay, the next question is, are you planning on using media types that specify which document is being set and which version of schema was used? Well, he's got some, for example, application/vnd.CIECA.assignment add RQ-V1 plus JSON as opposed to application/JSON.
We haven't actually within CIECA given that much thought or airing, but these are certainly the considerations we have to face up to when we have a trading partner that wants to come on board. So this sounds like a question from someone who could be a real contributor to our architecture group and get us up to date on those kind of issues.
Thanks. Yeah. So, Dan, I'm going to send this question to you. So something we should discuss in our architecture committee, because I think it's a good suggestion.
Yeah, very good.
Okay. Next question is, can I get a copy of this recorded presentation to give to our developer? Absolutely. This is being recorded, and I will have it posted out on CIECA.com, usually by, hopefully by this afternoon, if not tomorrow at the latest. So that'll be available at CIECA.com. You can go to CIECA webinars and you can find a link to the YouTube video. That's all the questions I have. Anybody, any additional questions before we wrap it up? If not, well then thank you all very much for joining us. Hopefully this was informative and helped you have a better understanding of where we're going with CAPAS. There is a lot of work going on at the moment, and you'll start to see the fruits of that labor in the near future on CIECA.com. If you have a need and there's something that a project you're working on and you haven't seen it on CIECA.com or haven't heard about it, please feel free to reach out to me or Paulette, and we'll be happy to see what we can do to help you. We're eager to get this out there and in use. So thank you all very much. As I mentioned, this has been recorded, will be available later today at CIECA.com. And with that, this concludes today's webinar. Thank you all very much.